The fluorescent lights in family courtroom 4B hummed with the same monotonous drone that had filled Eleanor Walsh's ears for the past 3 months. She sat in the worn wooden chair, her arthritis-gnarled hands folded in her lap, watching her 8-year-old grandson fidget beside his court-appointed advocate. Tommy's small legs swung back and forth, his sneakers barely reaching the floor, and every few seconds he would glance over at her with those eyes, David's eyes, filled with a confusion that broke her heart all over again. Across the aisle, Melissa sat with her lawyer, a sharp-suited woman who spoke in clipped sentences and wielded legal jargon like a scalpel. Even now, 6 months after David's funeral, Eleanor could barely look at her daughter-in-law without feeling the familiar surge of grief mixed with something darker, something that tasted like betrayal. "Your Honor," Melissa's attorney was saying, her voice echoing in the sterile courtroom, "my client has been the primary caregiver for Thomas since birth. Mrs. Walsh, while well-intentioned, is 72 years old and simply cannot provide the stability and care that a growing boy needs." Judge Patricia Hernandez, a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and kind but tired eyes, nodded thoughtfully. Eleanor had learned to read the subtle expressions on the judge's face over these long months. The slight furrowing of her brow when testimony didn't add up, the way she leaned forward when something particularly important was being said. Right now, she looked like a woman trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Mrs. Walsh," the judge said, turning to Eleanor, "you've testified that Thomas has expressed a desire to live with you. Can you elaborate on this?" Eleanor's throat felt dry as sandpaper. She had rehearsed this moment countless times with her own attorney, a kind man named Robert Chen who worked for a fraction of his usual fee because he believed in her case. But now, under the harsh courtroom lights, with Melissa's cold stare boring into her, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor began, her voice stronger than she felt. "Tommy has been staying with me every weekend since his father passed. And every Sunday night when it's time to go home, he asks me the same question. Grandma Ellie, why can't I just stay here forever?" "Objection," Melissa's attorney interrupted. "Hearsay." "Overruled," Judge Hernandez said firmly. "This is family court, counselor, not criminal court. Mrs. Walsh, please continue." Eleanor took a shaky breath. "He's told me repeatedly that he wants to live with me. He's shown me bruises." "Alleged bruises," Melissa's lawyer interjected. "Bruises on his arms and back that he says came from his mother's boyfriends. He's hungry when he comes to my house, dirty, and sometimes he hasn't been to school in days." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor watched Tommy's small shoulders tense, saw him glance anxiously between her and his mother. The boy had been through enough. She hated that he had to hear this, had to be in this room at all. "Your Honor," Melissa finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion that sounded genuine enough to fool anyone who hadn't lived with her lies for 3 years. "I love my son more than anything in this world. Yes, I've struggled since David died, we all have, but I'm his mother. Tommy is confused and grieving, and Mrs. Walsh has been filling his head with stories about me. She's never forgiven me for marrying her son, and now she's using his death to try to take my boy away from me." The tears that rolled down Melissa's cheeks looked real. Eleanor had to admit that her daughter-in-law was a gifted performer. She had fooled David for years, after all, convincing him that the bruises on Tommy were from playground accidents, that the boy's behavioral problems at school were just a phase, and that Eleanor was an interfering old woman who couldn't accept that her precious son had grown up and moved on. David had believed it all, right up until that terrible night when he'd come home early from his business trip and found Tommy locked in his bedroom closet while Melissa entertained her latest boyfriend downstairs. The fight that had followed had been so vicious that neighbors called the police. 2 days later, David had a massive heart attack at 34 years old. The doctors said it was a genetic defect, a ticking time bomb that stress had finally triggered. Eleanor blamed Melissa. She always would. "Mrs. Walsh," Judge Hernandez said gently, pulling Eleanor back to the present. "I understand that you believe Thomas would be better off in your care, but the law presumes that children should remain with their natural parents, unless there's compelling evidence to the contrary. The social worker's report indicates that while Thomas's home environment isn't ideal, there's no evidence of abuse that would warrant removal." "But there is," Eleanor started. "The photographs you submitted show minor bruising consistent with normal childhood activities," the judge continued. "And while I'm sympathetic to your concerns about your daughter-in-law's lifestyle choices, dating as a single mother isn't grounds for terminating parental rights." Eleanor felt her last shred of hope crumbling. She thought about Tommy's small voice on the phone just last week, whispering that he was scared, that Melissa's new boyfriend, Chuck, had hit him for spilling juice on the carpet. She thought about how thin the boy had gotten, how the light had gone out of his eyes in the months since his father died. However, Judge Hernandez continued, given the unusual circumstances of this case and the child's age, I think it would be appropriate to hear from Thomas directly. Eleanor's heart lurched. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this. The thought of putting Tommy on the spot, forcing him to choose between his mother and grandmother in open court, made her stomach turn. But maybe it was their only chance. The bailiff called Tommy forward, and the boy walked slowly to the witness chair, his Pokemon backpack dragging behind him. He looked so small sitting there, his feet dangling, his messy brown hair falling into his eyes the way David's used to. Judge Hernandez leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Hi, Thomas. Do you know why we're all here today?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "Because Mom and Grandma Allie are fighting about where I should live?" "That's right. And I want you to know that whatever you say here today, nobody's going to be mad at you, okay? I just want to know how you really feel." The boy glanced at his mother, then at Eleanor, his small face scrunched with worry. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble. I just want to ask you a few questions. Can you tell me where you'd like to live?" For a long moment, Tommy was quiet. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could sense Melissa tensing across the aisle. Everything hung on this moment, on whatever came out of this little boy's mouth. "I want to live with Grandma Allie," Tommy said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but before she could feel any relief, Melissa stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my son is 8 years old and has been manipulated by his grandmother for months. She's been telling him stories about me, bribing him with toys and treats, making him think I'm some kind of monster. He doesn't understand what he's saying." "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Hernandez said firmly, "please sit down and let me conduct this hearing." But Melissa wasn't finished. "He's just a child, Your Honor. He doesn't know what's best for him. I'm his mother. I carried him for 9 months. I gave birth to him. I've raised him his entire life." Mrs. Walsh swoops in with her big house and her guilt money, and suddenly she thinks she can take my son away from me? "Mom," said Tommy quietly from the witness chair, but Melissa didn't hear him. "She's poisoned him against me. She's never liked me, never accepted me into the family. She blamed me when David died, as if his heart attack was somehow my fault. Now she's using her grief to steal my child?" "Mom, that's not true," Tommy said, louder this time. "You don't know what you're talking about, Tommy," Melissa snapped, turning to face her son. "You're 8 years old. You think living with Grandma would be fun because she lets you eat ice cream for breakfast and stay up late? But that's not real life. I'm your mother. I know what's best for you." Eleanor watched in horror as Tommy's face crumpled. The boy's eyes filled with tears, and his small hands gripped the arms of the witness chair. "But I don't want to live with you," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't want to live with you. You're mean to me. You let Chuck hit me. You forget to feed me dinner. And last night—" "Tommy, stop lying," Melissa sharply. "I'm not lying," Tommy cried, and Eleanor was shocked by the strength in his small voice. "I'm not lying, and I can prove it." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hernandez leaned forward. "What do you mean, Thomas?" Tommy reached into his Pokemon backpack and pulled out his phone, a simple device Eleanor had given him so he could call her whenever he needed to. His small fingers worked the screen with the practiced ease of his generation. "Can I show you a recording from last night?" Eleanor's breath caught. Melissa went very still. Even the court reporter stopped typing. "What kind of recording, Thomas?" Judge Hernandez asked carefully. "I've been recording things," Tommy said, his voice growing stronger. "Dad taught me how before he died. He said if anyone ever hurt me and I couldn't tell him about it, I should record it so I'd have proof." Eleanor felt her heart breaking all over again. David, sweet David, had known. Somehow he had known that his son would need protection, and he had given him the tools to protect himself. "Your Honor," Melissa's attorney started,
We object to any alleged recording. Chain of custody hasn't been established and let the boy speak, Judge Hernandez said firmly. Her entire demeanor had changed. The tired resignation in her eyes had been replaced by sharp attention. Tommy's thumb moved across his phone screen. This was last night, around 10 o'clock. Mom thought I was asleep, but I heard yelling downstairs. He held up his phone, and the courtroom held its breath as a tinny audio recording began to play. Melissa's voice, slurred with alcohol. Where the hell is my cigarettes? A man's voice, presumably Chuck. How should I know? Maybe the brat took 'em. Tommy? Tommy wouldn't. That kid's been nothing but trouble since I moved in. Always whining, always in the way. You need to do something about him. What? Send him to his grandmother permanently. Or better yet, one of those boarding schools for problem kids. He needs discipline. I can't just. The hell you can't. You're his mother. And if you want me to stick around, you better figure it out. I'm not going to keep putting up with that little shit. A crash, like something being thrown. Chuck, don't. Don't what? Don't tell you how to raise your kid? Maybe I should go upstairs and teach him some manners myself. No, please, he's just a little boy. Then act like his mother and control him, or I will. The recording cut off. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Tommy looked up at Judge Hernandez with eyes too old for his young face. There's more, he said quietly. Lots more. Chuck hits me when Mom's not looking, and sometimes when she is looking. He locks me in my room when I cry. And Mom doesn't stop him because she's scared he'll leave. Eleanor was crying openly now, not caring who saw. Across the aisle, Melissa had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Tommy, Judge Hernandez said gently, how long have you been making these recordings? Since right after Dad died. At first, it was just because I missed him and wanted to remember his voice from the voicemails he left me. But then, Chuck moved in and things got scary, so I started recording the scary stuff too. Dad always said that grown-ups don't always believe kids, but they have to believe evidence. Smart boy, Eleanor thought through her tears, just like his father. Judge Hernandez turned to Melissa. Mrs. Martinez, do you have anything to say about what we've just heard? Her attorney whispered frantically in her ear, but Melissa shook her head and stood up slowly. Your Honor, that recording is taken out of context. Chuck and I were we'd been arguing. He didn't mean. Tommy? Melissa interrupted, his voice steady now. Show them your arms. What? Show them your arms. Show them the bruises Chuck gave you last week when you tried to stop me from hitting me. Eleanor gasped. In all her focus on Tommy's welfare, she had not considered that Melissa might be a victim too. She looked at her daughter-in-law with new eyes, seen past the makeup to the shadows underneath, the way she held her left arm protectively against her side. Mrs. Martinez, Judge Hernandez said firmly, I'm going to ask you a very important question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe that Thomas would be safer living with his grandmother while you get the help you need to address your situation? Melissa looked at Tommy, still sitting in the witness chair with his phone clutched in his small hands. The boy was watching her with an expression of hope mixed with wariness, as if he was afraid to believe that his mother might finally choose his safety over her own fear. Yes, she said, her voice barely audible. Yes, I think he would be safer with Eleanor. I want him to be safe more than I want anything in the world.
Tommy slipped down from the witness chair and ran to his mother, wrapping his arms around her waist. Mom, I don't hate you, he said fiercely. I just want us all to be okay. Eleanor felt her heart expanding in her chest, making room for feelings she hadn't allowed herself in 3 years. Looking at Melissa, really looking at her, she saw not the woman who had taken her son away, but a scared young mother who had lost her way. Judge Hernandez was writing notes quickly. I'm going to issue a temporary order placing Thomas in the custody of his grandmother, Mrs. Walsh, while I order an immediate investigation into the domestic violence allegations. Mrs. Martinez,
I'm also going to require you to obtain a restraining order against Mr. Charles Davidson and to attend counseling sessions as a condition of future visitation rights. She looked directly at Eleanor. Mrs. Walsh, while I'm granting your petition for temporary custody, I want to be clear that this is not a permanent arrangement unless it proves to be in Thomas's best interest long-term. I'll be ordering regular check-ins with social services, and I strongly encourage family counseling for all parties involved. Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of what the judge was saying. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about healing a broken family. Your Honor, Tommy said, raising his small hand like he was in school. Can I say something? Judge Hernandez smiled for the first time all day. Of course, Thomas. I want my mom to get better, he said seriously. And I want to live with Grandma Ellie where it's safe. But I don't want to never see Mom again. She's still my mom even when she makes bad choices. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes again. This wise, brave little boy was so much like his father, it took her breath away. I think that can be arranged, Judge Hernandez said softly. The court is adjourned. As the courtroom began to empty, Eleanor remained standing between Tommy and Melissa, one hand on her grandson's shoulder, the other still resting on her daughter-in-law's arm. What happens now? Melissa asked quietly. Now we figure it out. All of us, together. It's what David would have wanted. Tommy looked up at both women. Can we go get ice cream? I think we all need ice cream right now. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself laughing through her tears. You know what, kiddo? I think you're absolutely right. As they walked out of the courthouse together, not as enemies, but as a family trying to find their way back to each other, Eleanor thought about the recording that had changed everything. David had been right to teach his son to document the truth. But more than that, he had been right to teach him that love and honesty could overcome even the darkest situations. The fluorescent lights of Family Courtroom 4B hummed behind them as they stepped out into the afternoon sun. 3 generations bound together by loss, but determined to build something better from the pieces that remained. 6 months later, Eleanor sat in her kitchen watching Tommy help Melissa make pancakes for Sunday breakfast. It had been a long and difficult road. Melissa had moved into the small apartment above Eleanor's garage, close enough for Tommy to feel secure, but far enough for both women to maintain their independence. The counseling sessions had been painful at first, dredging up years of resentment and misunderstanding, but slowly they had begun to heal. Chuck was out of their lives permanently, facing charges for domestic violence and child endangerment. The recordings on Tommy's phone had provided more than enough evidence to ensure he would never be able to hurt any of them again. Melissa still struggled with anxiety and the lingering effects of the emotional abuse she had endured, but she was getting stronger every day. She had started taking classes at the local community college and had found a part-time job at a daycare center where her natural love for children could flourish in a healthy environment. Tommy was thriving. He had gained weight, his grades had improved, and most importantly, the light had returned to his eyes. He still had nightmares sometimes, but they were becoming less frequent. The phone that had once been used to record his pain now mostly contained videos of him playing with the neighbor's dog or FaceTiming with friends from school. Grandma Ellie, Tommy called from the stove, Mom says you have to tell us the story about Dad and the great pancake disaster of 2010. Eleanor laughed, settling back in her chair with her coffee. Well, it all started when your father decided he was going to impress your mother with his cooking skills. As she began the familiar story, she caught Melissa's eye and saw gratitude there along with something that looked like hope. They had all learned that family wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up for each other, especially when things got hard. The recording on Tommy's phone had saved them all, but it was love that had put them back together again. And that, Eleanor thought, was exactly how it should be. But the path to this Sunday morning hadn't been straight or easy. The memories of those first weeks after the court decision still made Eleanor's chest tighten with anxiety and doubt. The first night. The night Tommy came to live with her permanently, he had stood in the doorway of David's old room, now freshly painted blue with new superhero bedsheets, clutching a garbage bag of his belongings and looking smaller than his 8 years. Is it okay if I'm scared? He had whispered. Eleanor had knelt down to his level, her knees protesting the movement, and taken his small hands in hers. Sweetheart, being scared just means you're being brave, and you've been the bravest boy I know. That first night, Tommy had woken up screaming 3 times. She had rushed to his room to find him sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with terror, calling for his father. She had held him until dawn, rocking him the way she used to rock David when he was small, whispering stories about better tomorrows and unconditional love. "What if Mom forgets about me?" Tommy had asked, as the sun began to creep through the curtains. "Oh, honey," Eleanor had said, her heart breaking for this little boy who had been through so much. "Your mother could never forget about you. She's just learning how to be strong again, and that takes time. But forgetting you? Never." The early days had been a delicate dance of establishing routines while honoring Tommy's need to process his trauma. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the child psychologist Judge Hernandez had recommended, had warned Eleanor that healing wasn't linear. There would be good days and setbacks, moments of progress followed by regression. She had been right. Tommy would have days where he seemed like any normal 8-year-old, laughing at cartoons, begging for extra cookies, getting excited about school projects. Then something would trigger a memory, a raised voice from the neighbors, a car door slamming too hard, even the smell of cigarettes from a passing stranger, and he would retreat into himself, becoming quiet and watchful. Eleanor learned to read the signs, the way his shoulders would hunch when he felt unsafe, how he would unconsciously touch his phone in his pocket when anxiety spiked, the particular stillness that came over him when his mind was processing difficult emotions. Learning to trust again. 3 weeks after Tommy moved in, Eleanor found him sitting on the floor of his closet at 2 in the morning, his phone clutched to his chest, tears streaming down his face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she had asked gently, settling onto the floor beside him despite her protesting joints. "I had a dream about Chuck. He was here, and he was angry because I told on him. And you weren't strong enough to stop him." Eleanor's heart had clenched. This was her deepest fear too, that she was too old, too fragile to truly protect this precious boy. But she had learned from Dr. Mitchell that children needed honesty, not false reassurances. "Tommy, look at me," she had said firmly. "I want you to know something very important. Chuck can never hurt you again. Never. Do you know why?" Tommy had shaken his head, his eyes wide in the dim light from the hallway. "Because you were brave enough to speak the truth. Because Judge Hernandez listened. Because there are laws that protect children and grown-ups whose job it is to make sure those laws work. And because I will never, ever let anyone hurt you again. Not while there's breath in my body." She had pulled out her own phone then, showing him the contacts she had programmed. Dr. Mitchell, the social worker, the police department, even Judge Hernandez's clerk. "See all these numbers? These are our safety net. We're not alone in this. Tommy has a whole team of people looking out for you." That night, Tommy had finally fallen asleep in his own bed, but Eleanor had stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and praying to David that she was strong enough for what lay ahead. The slow healing of Melissa. While Tommy was learning to feel safe again, Melissa was fighting her own battles. The restraining order against Chuck had been the easy part. He had violated it within a week by showing up drunk at her old apartment, and the police had arrested him without incident. But breaking free from the psychological chains of abuse proved far more difficult. Eleanor had watched her daughter-in-law struggle with a mixture of compassion and frustration. There were days when Melissa would seem to make real progress in therapy, talking about boundaries and self-worth and healthy relationships. Then there were days when she would collapse into self-doubt and guilt, convinced that she was a terrible mother who didn't deserve to be part of Tommy's life. The breakthrough had come during a particularly difficult family counseling session about 2 months after the court decision. Dr. Rebecca Chen, their family therapist, had been working with them on communication and trust building when Melissa had suddenly burst into tears. "I don't understand how you can even look at me," she had sobbed, addressing Eleanor directly. "I let that monster hurt your grandson. I let him hurt my own son. What kind of mother does that?" Eleanor had felt the familiar anger, the protective fury that had sustained her through the custody battle. But something in Melissa's broken voice had cracked open a door in her heart that she hadn't even realized was closed. The kind of mother who was hurt and scared and doing the best she could with what she had. The kind of mother who was brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered most, she had said quietly. But I wasn't brave. Tommy was brave. An 8-year-old child was braver than his own mother. Sometimes children have to be brave first, Eleanor had replied, thinking of David at Tommy's age, standing up to schoolyard bullies twice his size. Sometimes they show us how it's done. That doesn't make you weak, Melissa. That makes you human. The conversation that followed had been the most honest one they had ever shared. Melissa had talked about growing up with an alcoholic father, about a mother who had taught her that a woman's worth was tied to whether she could keep a man happy. She had talked about the loneliness that had consumed her after David's death, and how Chuck's attention, even when it came with cruelty, had felt better than being alone. Eleanor had shared her own struggles, the guilt she felt about not seeing the signs of abuse sooner, the fear that she was too old to raise an active boy, the grief that still sometimes overwhelmed her when she least expected it. I blamed you for David's death, Eleanor had admitted, the words hanging heavy in the therapy office. I needed someone to be angry at, and you were there. But David's heart condition, that wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Sometimes I think it was, Melissa had whispered. All that stress, all those fights? No, Eleanor had said firmly. Doctors explained it to me after the funeral. He could have had that heart attack at 34, even if his life had been perfectly peaceful. Some things just happen, and we drive ourselves crazy trying to find someone to blame. That session had marked a turning point. It hadn't magically fixed everything. Healing never worked that way, but it had opened the door to forgiveness, both of each other and of themselves, building new traditions. As autumn turned to winter, the three of them had slowly begun to build new traditions together. Sunday breakfast became sacred, a time when they would gather in Eleanor's kitchen to cook together and share stories about the week. Melissa would talk about her classes and her job at the daycare. Tommy would regale them with tales from school, his teachers' quirks, and his evolving friendships. Eleanor would share memories of David's childhood, helping Tommy understand that his father had once been a little boy too, with fears and dreams and silly moments.
The first time Tommy had called Melissa Mom in front of Eleanor without flinching had been during one of these Sunday breakfasts in November. He had been telling them about a school project on family trees when he had casually said, "And Mom, can you help me find those pictures of Dad when he was little?" Eleanor had seen Melissa's eyes fill with tears of relief, and she had reached across the table to squeeze her daughter-in-law's hand. Christmas had been another milestone. They had decided to celebrate together in Eleanor's house, decorating David's childhood tree with ornaments that told the story of their family. Tommy had insisted on making paper angels for his father, hanging them in the window where the light could shine through them. "So Dad can see them from heaven," he had explained, with the matter-of-fact faith of childhood. Melissa had made Christmas dinner, following the recipes David had loved, while Eleanor had taught Tommy how to make the sugar cookies that had been a Walsh family tradition for 3 generations. The day hadn't been perfect. There had been moments of sadness, times when David's absence felt overwhelming, but it had been theirs, and it had been filled with love. Tommy's courage continued. As winter melted into spring, Tommy had shown remarkable resilience, but he had also continued to demonstrate the same courage that had saved them all in that courtroom. When a new student at school was being bullied by older kids, Tommy had stood up for him, earning himself a black eye, but also the respect of his teachers and classmates. "Why didn't you just walk away?" Eleanor had asked him as she applied ice to his bruise. "Because walking away is what people do when they're scared to tell the truth," Tommy had replied with startling wisdom. "And I'm not scared of the truth anymore." He had also become an advocate for other children in difficult situations. When he learned about a classmate whose father drank too much and yelled, Tommy had quietly told his teacher, setting in motion the help that family needed. When he met a girl at the park whose stepmother was mean to her, he had encouraged her to talk to a trusted adult. Tommy has developed a very strong sense of justice, Dr. Mitchell had told Eleanor during one of their regular check-ins. Children who have been through trauma sometimes become very attuned to injustice in others. It's actually a healthy sign of healing, as long as we help him understand appropriate boundaries. Tommy's phone, the device that had once documented his darkest moments, had become something different now. He still recorded things, but now it was school plays and birthday parties, conversations with friends, and video messages for Eleanor when she wasn't feeling well. The technology that once preserved evidence of his pain now captured moments of joy. Melissa's growth. By spring, Melissa had transformed in ways that sometimes took Eleanor's breath away. The scared, defensive woman who had sat across the courtroom aisle had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more at peace with herself. Melissa had completed her court-mandated counseling and had chosen to continue with individual therapy. She had finished her first semester of college with a 3.8 GPA and had been promoted to assistant director at the daycare. Most importantly, she had learned to set boundaries and trust her instincts. "I almost started dating someone last month," Melissa had told Eleanor one afternoon as they worked together in the garden behind the house. Eleanor had looked up from the tomato plants they were staking, surprised by the casual way Melissa had mentioned it. "Almost?" He seemed nice at first, but then he made a comment about how I needed to control Tommy better when Tommy interrupted us talking at the park. It was just a small thing, but Melissa had paused, brushing dirt off her hands. Something inside me said no. David used to say I should trust my instincts more. I'm finally learning how. Eleanor had felt a surge of pride for her daughter-in-law. "What did you do?" "I told him that Tommy was a normal 8-year-old boy who was excited to meet someone new, and that any man who wanted to be in my life needed to understand that my son comes first, always." Melissa had smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. He didn't like that answer. "Then you dodged a bullet." "Yeah, I think I did." The conversation had reminded Eleanor of something Dr. Chen had said during one of their family sessions. Healing wasn't about returning to who you were before trauma. It was about becoming someone stronger, someone who could integrate the lessons learned from surviving difficult experiences. The extended family. As their little family unit had stabilized, they had also begun to reconnect with David's extended family. Eleanor's sister Margaret, who lived across the country, had finally come for a visit in April. She had been nervous about meeting Melissa under the circumstances, but the weekend had gone beautifully. Margaret had told Eleanor as they sat on the porch watching Tommy teach Melissa how to throw football, "David would be so proud of what you've all built together." David's college friends had also started including them in gatherings again. At first, the invitations had been awkward. No one quite knew how to navigate the complicated dynamics of the custody situation. But as word spread about how the family had healed and come together, the social connections that had been strained by grief and legal battles began to mend. Tommy particularly loved these gatherings because they gave him access to stories about his father that he had never heard. Tales of college pranks and road trips, of David's dreams and ambitions, of the man that he had been before he became a husband and father. "Dad really put a frog in Professor Williams's desk drawer?" Tommy had asked in delight after one such story session. "Your father was quite the troublemaker in his day," Eleanor had confirmed, ruffling Tommy's hair. "But he always owned up to his mistakes and tried to make things right." These connections to David's memory had become increasingly important as Tommy processed his grief. Dr. Mitchell had explained that children who lost parents often worried about forgetting them, and that building a rich understanding of who their parent had been could help with the healing process. Challenges and setbacks. Of course, not every day had been smooth. There had been setbacks and challenges that had tested their resolve and their commitment to each other. In February, Tommy had experienced a significant regression after a substitute teacher at school had raised his voice at the class. Tommy had hidden under his desk and refused to come out, eventually having to be picked up by Eleanor when he couldn't calm down. That night, he had begged her not to make him go back to school. "What if she yells again? What if she grabs me like Chuck used to?" he had asked, his small body trembling with remembered fear. Eleanor had called Dr. Mitchell, who had recommended they meet with the school principal to develop a plan for managing Tommy's triggers in the classroom. They had also worked with his regular teacher, Mrs. Patterson, to create signals Tommy could use if he felt overwhelmed. The process had taken weeks, but eventually Tommy had regained his confidence at school. The experience had taught them all that healing wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing process that required vigilance and flexibility. Melissa had come home shaking, all her old fears and self-doubts flooding back. What if she's right?
Melissa had asked Eleanor through tears. What if I did ruin his life? What if the judge was wrong to believe me? Eleanor had sat her down at the kitchen table and made her tea, the same way she used to do for David when he was troubled. Melissa, look at me, she had said firmly. Chuck ruined his own life by choosing to hurt people smaller and more vulnerable than himself. You didn't make him hit Tommy. You didn't make him hit you. Those were his choices, and he's facing the consequences of those choices. They had talked for hours that night, working through the complex emotions that came with standing up to an abuser. Eleanor had shared her own experiences with Tommy's grandfather, David's father, who had been emotionally abusive before Eleanor had found the strength to leave him when David was 12. It took me years to stop feeling guilty about breaking up David's family, Eleanor had admitted. But eventually I realized that staying would have been worse for David than leaving. Sometimes protecting the people we love means making hard choices that other people don't understand. The continuing journey. As spring had turned to summer, their family rhythm had become more natural, less effortful. Tommy had thrived in summer day camp, making new friends and developing interests in swimming and art. Melissa had taken a summer job as a camp counselor, building on her education coursework and her natural ability to connect with children. Eleanor had used the summer to focus on her own health, addressing some medical issues she had been putting off during the stress of the custody battle. A minor heart procedure in June had scared them all, but it had also reinforced how much they needed each other. Grandma Ellie, what if something happens to you too? Tommy had asked the night before her procedure. Eleanor had been honest with him about the risks, but she had also talked about the excellent doctors and the relatively simple nature of the procedure. But most importantly, she had said, you're not alone anymore. You have your mom, and you have all the grown-ups who care about you. You're not going to fall through the cracks ever again. The procedure had gone perfectly, and Eleanor's recovery had been swift. But the experience had prompted important conversations about the future, about what would happen as Eleanor aged, about how to ensure Tommy's security and stability over the long term. They had met with an attorney to update Eleanor's will and establish clear guardianship provisions. They had also explored options for Melissa to adopt Tommy officially, solidifying the legal bonds that already existed emotionally. I want to make sure that if anything happens to me, there's no question about where Tommy belongs, Eleanor had told the lawyer. With me, Melissa had said quietly but firmly. He belongs with me. I'm his mother, and I always will be. The legal paperwork had been filed, and the adoption hearing was scheduled for the fall. Judge Hernandez would preside, bringing their story full circle. A different kind of strength. Now, as Eleanor sat in her kitchen on this particular Sunday morning, watching Tommy help Melissa make pancakes, she marveled at the journey they had all taken. The boy who had once been afraid to speak above a whisper was now chattering excitedly about his upcoming birthday party. The young woman who had once cowered from her own shadow was now confidently flipping pancakes and laughing at her son's jokes. And Eleanor herself had discovered that age didn't necessarily mean fragility. She had found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, not in spite of her 73 years, but because of them. All the experience, all the wisdom, all the love she had accumulated over 7 decades had been preparation for this moment, this family, this calling. Grandma Ellie, Tommy said, interrupting her reverie. Mom says you have to tell us the story about Dad and the great pancake disaster of 2010. Eleanor laughed, settling back in her chair with her coffee. This story had become part of their Sunday tradition, along with the pancakes themselves and the comfortable chaos of family life. Well, it all started when your dad decided he was going to impress your mother with his cooking skills, she began, catching Melissa's eye and sharing a moment of connection that would have been impossible a year ago. As she told the familiar story, embellishing the details a little more each time, making Tommy giggle at his father's culinary failures, Eleanor thought about the phone recording that had changed their lives. Tommy's courage in that courtroom had been the catalyst, but it was the daily choice to love each other, to forgive each other, to show up for each other even when it was hard, that built the family they had become. The pancakes were indeed burning slightly on the griddle, filling the kitchen with the smell of slightly charred batter and the sound of laughter. Outside, the summer sun streamed through the windows, casting everything in warm golden light. Somewhere beyond the veil, Eleanor was certain David was watching over them all, proud of the family they had managed to build from the ashes of their shared grief. Tommy's laughter echoed through the kitchen as Melissa attempted to flip a pancake with dramatic flair, and it landed squarely on the floor. Eleanor found herself laughing too, not at the mess, but at the beautiful, imperfect, thoroughly alive chaos of family life restored and reimagined. In the living room, Tommy's phone sat forgotten on the coffee table, no longer a device for documenting fear, but simply one of many tools in a life filled with friends and fun, and the secure knowledge that he was loved and protected. The truth had set them all free. But love, messy, complicated, fierce, and endlessly forgiving, had brought them home. And as Eleanor watched her grandson help his mother clean up the pancake disaster, both of them dissolving into giggles, she knew that David's greatest gift to them all hadn't been the lesson about recording evidence. It had been the example of how to love unconditionally, how to fight for family, and how to believe that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive. The recording had been just the beginning. Everything that mattered had happened after, in the quiet moments of trust rebuilt, in the gradual healing of wounded hearts, in the daily choice to see each other not as they had been at their worst, but as they were capable of becoming at their best. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to another beautiful Sunday. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk, families walked dogs, and the world continued its eternal dance of ordinary miracles. Inside Eleanor's kitchen, three people who had found each other in the wreckage of loss continued the harder, more important work of building a life together. The truth had set them free, but love, patient, persistent, and ultimately triumphant, had made them whole.